There are two types of insects that really stand out as causing all sorts of problems in the veggie garden: aphids and caterpillars. Today, I'm hanging out with Dr. Paul Horne. He's an entomologist here in St Andrews. He's going to teach you everything that you need to know about caterpillars and aphids, how to identify them, how to spot their eggs, how to get rid of them, what to do if you've got an infestation in your garden.
This box, what we have is a whole lot of aphids parasitised by a tiny little wasp.
So that was an aphid that's been eaten out from the inside, is that right?
That's exactly right.
Oh.
They look like crocodiles and they eat aphids.
I'll give you a hint. He's going to talk about why you shouldn't squish caterpillars or aphids. I've been doing this until now, and after what he's shown me, I am not going to be squishing caterpillars or aphids. Thank you so much for letting me come out to St Andrews, a beautiful part of the world.
It is.
You're an entomologist. What does that mean?
So an entomologist is simply someone that studies insects, and I tend to look at insects and other things, like closely related things like mites, sometimes slugs, slaters, usually pest problems. So there's the pupa. See, it's quite a big one.
Pupating means turning into the next phase of life.
Yeah, some people call it a cocoon or a chrysalis.
The main reason I actually reached out to you, I learned about you from talking to Jai, because I was fascinated by this. He said that he employs you to go and inspect their indoor grow houses, detect which pests they've got there, and then introduce an insect that will basically solve the problem naturally. Is that right?
Almost.
Almost,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. We don't offer a crop monitoring service as such. We teach people how to not just rely on pesticides. And in some situations like protected cropping, which means under a glass or plastic, the problems are magnified. Pesticide residues last a lot longer if they were to use it, which disrupts the biological control. There's now several biological control producers that grow and sell predatory insects and mites and parasitic insects and mites, and so they can use those instead of pesticides. But it's obviously very specific, and you need to know what you're doing or you're just wasting your money. To most people, the things I look at, it's like a hidden world. It's right under their noses, but until you actually start looking, most people don't realise it's there.
So a lot of people who have their own veggie gardens will be very familiar with a couple. So let's talk about aphids and caterpillars. What's an aphid?
So most people call insects bugs, but there is actually like 25 or so different orders of insects, and one of them is the true bugs. And true bugs are sucking insects. Aphids are a type of true bug, and so they're a sucking insect.
How can people spot them easily?
There's a couple of ways. You can actually find the aphids. They might be on the growing tips or on the underside of leaves, depends on the plant. And so there's a stage with wings. So insects have wings as adults and they don't have wings when they're juveniles. But aphids have a double life cycle, and so the winged aphids will come in at, say, springtime, find your rose bushes or your cabbages, and then the next generation as adults won't have any wings, and so they look like little balls. So you can find colonies of these things, but the other way you can find them is because they're feeding on sap, which is high in sugar and low in protein. To get enough protein, they keep on sucking the sap and they excrete all the sugary waste. And so if you've got a rose bush or a citrus tree and you find black sooty mould growing on the leaves, that's actually a mould that's growing on the sugar.
And sometimes they curl the leaves up?
Often they curl the leaves up, and so I've got a cherry tree, and in springtime the aphids find it and they distort the leaves. So this is a plum, and it's attacked in springtime by a very particular aphid that makes the growing tips curl. These leaves aren't affected. It only gets into some leaves. And so if this was probably on a commercial farm, they would want to do something about that. But this is just a few plums in my backyard. I'm not going to worry about it, and there's plenty of plums here.
So I'm most familiar with the little green aphids, but there are a few different types, aren't they? So the ones I have at home, when they break out or when there's an infestation, there's just masses of little green spots
Yep.
underneath the leaves. Is that the main type of aphid, or what are the different sort of colours we should be looking out for?
Colours are variable. There's a lot of different green aphids.
Yep.
The most common one is green peach aphid,
Yep.
or in potatoes there's potato aphid. Both of those are green, and in the wingless stage they would look pretty similar. They don't move a lot, you know, they're plant feeders, they don't need to. But one that's pretty easy to find and is really common is a grey cabbage aphid, and so that's restricted to brassica plants, so things like cauliflowers and broccoli, and they're covered in a sort of grey waxy coating. That's probably a defensive thing, that things like ladybirds probably don't like eating that waxy coat.
So what should people do if they notice that they've got an aphid infestation?
So this is where looking for the things that eat the aphids becomes important, and so most people will recognise ladybirds, the adult ladybirds, but juvenile ladybirds look very different.
They're weird looking, aren't they? I just saw a picture of it before and I would never have recognised that as being a type of ladybird.
No, they transform massively from the larval stage to the adult stage. So yeah, looking for the things that eat them, and ladybirds is one, hoverflies is another, and adult hoverflies hang still in the air, that's why their name. They just eat nectar, so you find them near flowers, but the larval stage are predatory, and they just look like they are a maggot, and they have no wings, and they have
dangerous little maggots.
Yes.
It's funny thinking of things like ladybirds and maggots as being predatory. You just
Yeah, but they are, and they eat a lot.
yeah.
Some of the most common predators, insect predators, things like brown lacewings and green lacewings, like ladybirds. People might recognise the adults, but it's the juvenile stages that actually do most of the predation. And they have big jaws at the front of their body, so they're forward pointing, they're long skinny things, they're forward pointing, and the jaws are at the front, and the jaws are hollow. So they grab their prey and basically suck the juice out of them.
Gross. But great.
Yeah. But on top of that, there's parasites, and the parasites are not visible for most of their life, and even in the adult stage they're absolutely tiny. One of the main things that controls aphids are tiny little wasps, and so when I say wasps, most people think European wasp, nasty, you know. They're not. They only attack aphids, and they're the size of an aphid, and they live most of their life as a maggot inside the aphid, and so you can't see it. So quite often a lot of home gardeners will tell me, to control aphids we just go out and squash the aphids. But actually what they're doing mostly is squashing the maggots of the wasp inside the aphids, and so they'll never get control. Whereas if they were to leave it, sure, there'll be some aphid problems to start with, but then the wasps will take over and the colony of aphids, the colonies usually crash. So in this box, what we have is a whole lot of aphids parasitised by a tiny little wasp.
Oh my goodness.
So
these are the wasps that we're looking at.
yeah, so these were aphids, but then they got stung by these wasps, and the wasps basically ate the aphids from the inside, and what we've got is what come out of those.
So you had a box full of aphids and now you've got a box full of wasps.
Exactly.
That's wild.
That's right.
If people see these in their garden, how can they differentiate these from other little flying bugs?
So the difference between a wasp and a fly in one regard is they've got a constricted waist. So if you look at them, you can see they've got some pretty strong antennae at the front, and then the head and thorax, and then there's a real constriction before the abdomen. So it's like it's in two parts.
Mm-hmm. There you go. And there's literally, you won't find any aphids in there anymore?
I doubt it, but what we do have
Oh, what are they?
These are the aphids.
They were the aphids.
They were the aphids. What you would look for, let's say you had a rose bush that had aphids on it. If you start seeing these little balls appear.
So that was an aphid that's been eaten out from the inside, is that right?
That's exactly right.
Oh, I would have, at a glance, thought that it was some kind of caterpillar poop.
Well, it's about the same size as some caterpillar poo, but you might see that some of those little round balls, we call them mummies, they've got a hole in them, and that's where the wasp has emerged from that aphid. In fact, I think there's one down there that's just emerging right now over on the left.
There. That one.
Yeah. So in nature, that aphid mummy shell, it would be stuck to the leaf, and so he'd be able to pull himself out.
Is that another one there? What's happening down here?
Yeah. They're just trying to extract themselves out of the cocoon. So the body of the aphid has now become the cocoon of the wasp.
Wow. So this is this little wasp's first
day
exposure into the world, and it's going, hang on, what's all this plastic stuff?
Got to hang her on.
That is very cool. This one's struggling to get out.
Yeah, they'll all struggle to get out, I think.
So you should actually let them go?
I would leave some go, yes.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be the whole lot. You could pick a plant, if
Yeah.
it's a rose bush, let them go on one and see what happens.
Yeah.
But that'll build up a population of parasites, which will then control the
So
rest.
I have heard someone say, oh, I'm netting so-and-so to control the aphids. Is that the worst thing you can do?
It'd have to be a pretty fine mesh to keep aphids out.
But you'd be keeping aphids in, I imagine.
You might be excluding the ladybirds and the lacewings and the hoverflies.
Yeah.
So it might not be a good idea.
Yeah. What about sprays?
So in the home garden, there's not as many options as in commercial agriculture, but I'd be very careful about spraying for things because they may do what you want in killing the pest, but if they kill the beneficial species, the parasites and predators, then you've probably got ongoing problems which will require ongoing treatment. So even things that are organic, like pyrethrum, it's organic because it comes from a flower, a daisy flower, but it's broad spectrum, so it's not selective.
I've heard some people suggest you can spray them off with water. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, same as squashing them. It'll work, but you'll be removing the parasites, and so you're losing the biocontrol agents. So you get a short-term gain, but in the long run, is it effective? You'll have to keep on washing them off.
So it sounds like people are just really impatient, and if you just let nature go, it tends to work itself out.
Yeah, sometimes the damage is not acceptable, that waiting between the arrival of the pest and the arrival of the beneficial. So sometimes you do have to intervene, and in commercial agriculture that's usually what happens. But if you can tolerate some damage, just keep an eye on it, and once you start to see the parasites and predators there, you can be pretty confident they'll get control. If you can't find those and the pest problem's getting worse, you need to do something. Quite often, if you can plant something that you're not worried about, we call it a sacrificial planting, and even in commercial crops I get growers to do this, attract the pest in something that you don't really care about, and then the things that eat it will find them, and then when you plant your real crop that you are worried about next to it, there's no lag between the arrival of the pest and the arrival of the beneficials, because the beneficials are already there.
So are there things that attract the beneficials, being ladybirds, lacewings, and these parasitic wasps? Have I said that right?
Yep.
Other than aphids?
The aphids are necessary for the wasps to breed up and build up, but you can encourage the adult wasps to be there and live longer by providing them with a nectar source. So things like coriander that is, may have gone to seed, gone to flower, and so it actually has a value as a nectar source for beneficials.
Would most other flowers do the same thing?
You don't want to encourage pests, and so the pests also feed on pollen and nectar. So the things that have lots and lots of little flowers, like parsley and coriander, are usually better for beneficial species and not so good for the pests.
I could talk all day. I've got to make sure I don't talk all day. Okay, do you feel like we've covered the main aphid points?
There's a couple of others. I've mentioned the aphids have this double life cycle. They have winged adults or wingless adults. If they've got no wings as adults, they're happy where they are, but they can actually detect if the plant is senescing. So like a potato, once it reaches the end of its life and it starts to die down, the aphids know it's time to move, and so the next generation has wings again, and it goes. The other thing with aphids is we often hear, oh, they weren't here yesterday and now there's hundreds of them. Well, they were there yesterday, but aphids don't lay eggs externally. They give birth to live young.
And how many at a time?
Depends on the species, but once the aphid lands, it can lay a newborn one like straight away. And they're also quite weird in that one that's just born already has the embryo of the next generation in it. They don't need to mate often. A lot of the pest species that we have, they don't need a male. They are parthenogenic, and so the females can give birth to their offspring without mating.
So you could have one aphid arrive.
Yep.
Within the space of a week. What would be the maximum, roughly, number of aphids you might be able to get out of just that one?
I would think, if it lays a few every day, then, you're up around 20. And if those 20 then lay eggs the week after, you get an exponential increase very quickly.
I found, and I think we've talked about this before and you agreed with me, that if things are packed in too tightly, the aphids tend to thrive. But I found thinning out my plants is actually a really effective way of getting rid of the aphids, because maybe it's a less appealing spot for them to hide.
Once beneficials find them, they will also be favoured by those conditions. By thinning things out, you're probably reducing the pest population and also allowing access, for the predators to find them easily.
So Paul, there's obviously lots of different types of caterpillars. Let's maybe focus on the most common, or certainly the most common one that I've seen is the green caterpillar that I believe comes from the cabbage white butterfly. What can you tell me about them?
A lot of people would have seen cabbage white butterflies as the butterfly stage. They're a big white butterfly and they feed on flowers of all sorts, but they only breed on brassica crops. So there's a lot of brassicas.
How do they know what's a brassica and what's not? They seem to be able to spot them a mile away.
Well, they may lay their eggs on other things, but the larvae know that they can't eat that.
Yeah.
So they'll only survive on a brassica.
I think they know. I see them in my garden and they go straight for the brassicas.
They do. The adults will go to just about any flower, but they will only usually lay their eggs where their offspring are going to survive. It's a waste of energy to lay eggs on a gum tree when they can't eat that. So, but there's cabbage white butterfly, but there's also a much smaller caterpillar which goes by a couple of common names. One is diamondback moth, the other is cabbage moth. So there's cabbage moth and cabbage white butterfly.
How many people get that wrong?
A lot of people. And
like me.
Well, it's one's a butterfly, one's a moth, and the moth is active at like dawn and dusk usually. It's only about 1 centimetre long. It's a dull greyish colour. So whereas the butterfly is big, white and obvious, the cabbage moth is much more obscure.
So you're saying the butterfly is a problem, but the moth is a bigger problem?
In commercial crops, the moth is the bigger problem because it develops insecticide resistance, which means that the farmers that spray insecticides to control it, you don't want broccoli with holes and caterpillars in it, so to stop that, they will put an insecticide on. And when the caterpillars can tolerate that insecticide and it doesn't work, then it's a problem. And diamondback moth is, you could argue that it's the biggest insect pest of agriculture worldwide.
Wow. So if you can't specifically see the moth or the butterfly, when you're looking at a vegetable patch, what are the signs of one versus the other?
Okay. The eggs are quite different in shape and where they're laid. So moth eggs are pretty small, but if you know what to look for, you can see them. So on this leaf, there's multiple cabbage moth eggs, and they're very tiny, and they're the little yellow dots. There's 2 on that main vein. There's another one here, another one here. Each one of these is going to turn into a caterpillar, and so I can see that while that leaf looks nice and healthy now, probably in a week's time it'll have a lot of small holes, and if I do nothing, which is what's going to happen, in a couple of weeks there'll be more holes than leaf.
So a cabbage moth egg you're going to find on the vein on the upper side?
Usually, probably 80% would be on the veins. They like to lay them in a little groove. Sometimes they lay them on the underside, but mostly up on the top.
Whereas the cabbage white butterfly is going to be underneath and not necessarily on the vein.
All over the leaf, top, bottom. The next stage, of course, is when the caterpillar does start feeding. There'll be holes in leaves. And
both of them, obviously.
Yeah.
The same type of holes?
Slightly different. The cabbage moth, when it's very small, probably feeds on the underside and just chews the undersurface of the leaf, and so it looks like there's a window in the leaf because the cuticle is still intact on the top.
Yeah, so it's got the clear bit on the leaf. I've been wondering about that.
So
I googled it and Google was wrong. Google told me it was likely to be not being hardened off enough. So if you see a window on your leaves, could it be other things, or would you be pretty confident that's what it is?
In summertime, when these insects are active, that'd be the most likely, just on brassicas, only on brassicas. The other thing that happens with plants that are attacked by caterpillars, let's say they make a pinhole and then the caterpillar gets eaten or you kill it with a pesticide, that hole keeps growing as the leaf grows. And so people think the damage is getting worse and worse, and actually it's not. It's just the hole is growing with the leaf.
Okay, so what should people do?
Once again, you can watch for beneficial species, but if they're overwhelmed or the pest has got in first and there are no beneficial species there, probably the safest thing to do is to use an insecticide that's based on a bacteria, and the most common one that's available would be Dipel.
Okay.
It probably goes under various brand names. That's just one name, but it's Bacillus thuringiensis. That's the name of the bacteria.
How does that work?
It's only a poison. This is why it's so safe. Like if you or I eat it, nothing.
Fine.
It might taste horrible, but any other insect eats it, not going to do anything.
Great.
But it turns into a poison inside the stomach of a caterpillar.
Is this all caterpillars or just certain types of caterpillars?
Pretty much all caterpillars.
Okay, so we might be knocking off some butterflies too.
But they'd have to eat it. So mainly the only caterpillar that eats it is the pest one that you're worried about.
Genius.
It's not going to kill a butterfly that doesn't eat brassicas.
And is that something that you can get at your local nursery?
Easily.
I'll keep an eye out for that one.
I just check the use-by date. Because it's a bacteria, it's like if you make bread with yeast, if the yeast is too old, it doesn't work.
I would never have checked a use-by date for any garden products. I'm learning something every day.
Do it for this one.
I will find a link to something available online and I will put it in the description. What about simply picking them off or squishing them?
So you can pick them off and squish them, but if you do that, it might be worth looking and seeing if there's any parasites inside them. So in here are a lot of caterpillars, and these are cabbage moth, and they've been eating this cabbage. And these ones here are pupating, so they're going from the caterpillar stage through to the adult stage. So in a little while you would expect them to turn into a moth. However, these ones have been exposed to a parasitic wasp that stings them, and instead of turning into a moth, they will turn into a wasp. Tiny little wasp about the size of a mosquito.
And you're going to show me something cool, aren't you?
I hope so.
Okay, so we've got a magnifying glass here. And what are you showing me?
So there's a caterpillar here, and it looks like a healthy caterpillar, but it's probably been parasitized by the wasp. And if that's so, the maggot is about to take over and kill it. But
slippery little sucker.
He's a slippery.
Where's he gone?
I'm pulling it apart to see if there's a wasp maggot inside it. So when I squeeze it out, you can see his head's here, his tail's here, the gut tube is in between, but in between, as well as that, there's this little green thing here, and that's a wasp maggot. It's not part of the caterpillar.
AKA a good guy.
That's it. So this caterpillar that I pulled apart, in a day or so's time would have been killed by this maggot, and then a wasp would emerge.
And that wasp would then go on to help kill some of the others and control the problem.
That's right. So that caterpillar has caused some damage, but if you were wanting these in your garden, instead of all these caterpillars turning into moths to lay 500 more eggs and lots more caterpillars, the wasp will control the population.
So are you suggesting people should actually pull the caterpillars apart if they see them?
Well, if they want to know that they're there, they can either wait until the caterpillar pupates, in which case it will look a bit different, and that's what most people are prepared to do. It's just, I would do this in a commercial farm because I'm going to have to advise the farmer whether he uses an insecticide or not. And if most of them are parasitized, as in like this, then no insecticide is needed. There's an absolutely tiny number of the wasp fauna that is a problem. Almost all of them are actually beneficial or benign. So.
We've talked about those caterpillars. Are there other caterpillars people should be aware of in their veggie gardens?
Yes.
We're opening a can of caterpillars here, aren't we?
So
anything that's just, I guess...
One thing's really common is Heliothis getting into tomatoes.
So would you basically use the same management for most of these caterpillars?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So if you can encourage beneficials, not just deal with the pests, so providing a nectar source for beneficial species will mean that when the pest moth flies in, the moth's not going to cause any damage, but when it lays its egg, it's laying its egg into an area where there's a lot of things that will eat those eggs, or tiny caterpillars. You can do two things. You can try and increase the beneficials, and then if you want to, say, to knock out some caterpillars because there's too many, spraying it with that bacterial spray, it won't affect the beneficials, and so they will still be there, and you will have knocked out the pests as well.
Now we are going to do a whole video on beneficials and how to attract them. People can click on that in a second, but for now we know there's the parasites that get into the caterpillars. Are there other beneficials that just eat caterpillars?
Yes.
Birds?
Yeah, a lot of things, and birds are one. Yeah, there's things that eat caterpillars. Even earwigs will eat caterpillars. Beetles will eat caterpillars. Yeah, there's both predators and parasites.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. We're going to keep talking about beneficials. That's going to be a different video, so have a look I'll put a link to it in the description actually. Have a look there if you want to check it out. Also, I found this fascinating, which Paul wrote, Backyard Insects. I'll also work out where you can get it online, and I will put a link in there because so many of these you can find in your backyards in Australia, and then work out exactly what you're looking at and what to do about it. Which often is nothing, leave it be. I run veggie garden tours in Melbourne, Australia at least every month, and I'm often out and about touring other amazing gardens as well, sharing with you everything I learn along the way. Hit subscribe if that sounds like something you want to learn about.